now. So, okay. So in terms of curing dyslexia, we know quite a bit now about what is necessary to help children overcome the issues they bring to the table. So before we get started, let's talk about what the causes of poor reading really are. And for many of you, this may be a review, but I want to ensure that everybody's has the same knowledge base. So we understand today that dyslexia is real, and that there are neurological differences between those children that have dyslexia and those that do not. I bring this up because there's still a belief out there that dyslexia is some kind of mythical made-up situation, that it's really a situation where these kids just haven't been taught well or their families haven't supported them well. But the research is pretty clear that there are clear neurological differences and that there are genetic differences for children who have severe reading problems versus kids that learn to read more easily. It is also true, though, that you can have family issues. If you're being raised in a family that is economically disadvantaged, you're more likely to have reading problems, primarily because your environment is not supportive of language and language learning. And of course, if you're a second language learner, if you have linguistic diversity, you may find it more difficult to learn to read in English. You may have some confusions between your native language and your home language. And it's also important to remember that a child can be dyslexic from a genetic neurological standpoint and also come from a family that has economic disadvantage and also come from a family that is linguistically diverse. So these things are not mutually exclusive. I would say that if a child is genetically predisposed to be dyslexic and then has these other issues of economic disadvantage and or linguistic diversity, you're probably dealing with a more serious situation. And we'll talk about why that might be as well. We also understand that one of the major contributors to dyslexia, or kids who look dyslexic who may not have the genetic predisposition for it, is instructional. And that really means instruction that doesn't support the understanding of how words work. And dyslexia at its very core is a phonological processing problem where kids don't naturally figure out how to map the sounds of the language onto the way the language is printed. And so I call that dyslexia, when our schools don't provide for kids what they need. And it is also true that a child who is not dyslexia may show up with some reading problems because they didn't receive the kind of instruction they needed, especially if they come from a background of economic disadvantage. So I'm going to call that dyslexia. That's not an official word, but I have a Ph.D., so I make words up now, and that's my new word. Of course, you can have all of the above issues. It can be a combination of the above. But we know that dyslexia in its true form is a genetic neurological issue. And let's take a look at some of that research. The researchers for a long time have been trying to find the dyslexia gene. And the truth is there's no one specific gene, and that there isn't like the dyslexia code piece that we can find. However, we do see combinations of issues with chromosomes 1, 2, 6, 15, -6, and 15 replicated. If you're a doctor, you know what I just said, at least a medical doctor. And those genes appear to be to come up often, but it may not be the same combination of gene issues for every child. But there is but we can identify differences in the genetic makeup of these children. And it is also true that if you have a family member, if your grandfather, your mother, or an aunt, or a brother, if somebody in the family of origin had severe reading problems, you can sometimes track these things back for generations, even though we didn't know to call it dyslexia. You'll see that this runs in families. For instance, my mother, who was an architect and a very smart woman, she failed first grade. They didn't know to call her dyslexic back in those days, but she clearly had some learning problems, and poor woman couldn't spell to save her life. Architecture was a safe place for her. She knew she couldn't be a secretary, so she might as well be an architect instead. However, given that it's a genetic predisposition, and I'm using that word predisposition for a very important reason, we know that 50% of how much of that dyslexia genetic predisposition shows up or is expressed by a particular child is accounted for by what happens in that child's environment. So we know it's 50% genetics and 50% environment. Clearly, we can't do anything about the genetics. Children bring their genetic background to us, but we have complete control over what happens in that child's environment. And so it's the environment that determines how severely a child that has this predisposition will show up. Or even if they have, what we understand now is that it's possible to ensure that this child with a predisposition for dyslexia doesn't really express it in the way we think about it, meaning that after first grade they're reading and they're not showing up with, they don't look very different from any other child, which of course is our goal. So we have to think about from what's in the medical language, we talk from genotype, which is your genetic makeup, to phenotype, which is the way it's expressed in the real world. So the genetics give a child a predisposition. It does not mean that that predisposition will express itself. In the same way that a person may have a predisposition for diabetes, that person, you may have a genetic predisposition to become diabetic if you allow yourself to become overweight and if you eat too much sugar and if your environment, if what happens to you turns on those genetics. However, if you're eating more healthfully and keep your weight down and things, the likelihood that that predisposition will express itself is reduced. This is actually a burgeoning field in medicine right now called, it's a field known as epigenetics. And it has to do with switching on genetics, you know, which genes get switched on and which genes don't. So in other words, you can come to the table with a genetic predisposition, and how much of that genetic predisposition is expressed is completely determined by what happens in the environment. That's very important for us to understand in schools because we own that environment. And it turns out that instruction is the most important environmental factor in terms of whether or not these children express or how severely their dyslexia is expressed. I like to share that in terms of this expression of phenotype, my younger brother was also dyslexic. We runs in families. We got a mom, we got me, we got my brother. I had a better instructional environment than my younger brother did. He did not learn to read till he was in the 7th grade. And that was after very serious interventions and things. We were probably, well, we know we come to the table with the same genetics. We were probably equally disposed to be equally as severe. However, I got a better first grade teacher my second time and had more help earlier, and I didn't have as many academic problems as my younger brother, who failed the 3rd grade 3 times and finally was put into a dyslexia program where they figured out, he was actually one of the lucky kids who he finally got taken to a place where they understood about phonemic awareness and things, and it's got him going. At any rate, all of this is important for us in the schools because we control the environment. Okay, so we understand a lot about dyslexia and neuroplasticity today. I just love these words, neuroplasticity, because plasticity of the brain is we now understand that it's not like the first 3 years and then it's done, or the first 6 years. We understand that the brain is actually very plastic all the way into adulthood. This is important because it means that interventions can always make a difference, because the brain is even in your 80s and such, your brain is constantly being able to be improved, or you can learn new information, which is really what neuroplasticity means. We also understand that reading in and of itself is not a natural process. And I know there's a lot of theories that have been espoused in reading that it's a natural language process, and if you just, immerse kids in literature, they'll figure it out. And it is probably true that those children that have a genetic predisposition to figure it out do figure it out with some instruction, not great instruction. But we're not worrying about those kids. We're talking about the kids that don't figure it out naturally, and they have to be taught in a very direct and explicit way. When that happens, then the brain learns how to process this information, and we can see that neurological structures in the brain is now formed, and so we can actually change how the brain organizes and brings this information in. We also know that the structure and the transparency of the language that a child is trying to learn to read in interacts with how well the brain learns how to process this information. So English, it turns out, is a very complex language. I know all of this audience probably understands that, but schools as a whole typically don't understand how complex it is to learn in English. And what we mean by, so English is considered an opaque language as compared to a language like Spanish. Let's look at Spanish. Spanish has 5 vowels. We talk about English as having 5 vowels, but that's actually not true. In Spanish, there's 5 vowels. It's the same 5 that we talk about in English. However, there's only one representation of each of those sounds. When it shows up in a word, it is said that one way. Children only have to learn 5 sounds, and that's it. In English, we have these 5 letters that we call the 5 vowels. They're actually representing 10 sounds, and then we get really confusing with kids because we can do these vowel teams and combine them, and there's actually 18 different vowel combinations. And then to make it more complex, those 18 combinations, sounds can be written a multitude of different ways, and sometimes they're irregular. That's opaqueness. That makes it very difficult for kids in English who have a natural predisposition not to really easily figure out how this mapping process works. It makes it even more difficult in our language. This does suggest that people who are working with kids who have dyslexia, or maybe they're not even dyslexic, they just don't come from an environment that has supported learning this information, it means that the teachers that are teaching this information have to be highly expert and have a very deep knowledge about how the structure of the English language works so that they can then teach that to the children. And what we find in our schools is that typically, at least general education teachers typically don't have that deep knowledge. And so that's an issue that we have to address in our field. And it turns out that teachers who have that deep knowledge are actually better teachers of reading for everybody, not just the kids with dyslexia, but it's critical content for those children who aren't going to learn this information easily. So I want to take a little tour through what we know about the brain structure and how it changes. And I'm sharing with you research that we've now known for almost 15 years. So this is not new information. However, what's important about the information is that we now have replicated these findings again and again and again. So I'm going to take you back to when it was brand new information and then understand that this information is known. It's like solid science now. It's not just we found this once, we found it again and again. Back in about 2000, we were asking the question, is that when we intervene with kids, we can see that they're learning to read better. We know that our interventions are working, but in a brain level, are we developing compensatory strategies or are we normalizing the brain? Why do we care? Well, it turns out that when you develop compensatory functions in your brain, those compensatory functions usually don't work as well as when the brain is functioning like a normal, typical brain. So if you think of somebody who's had like a stroke and they learn to speak again, their speech will often still be slurred a little bit and they have a little trouble. Compensatory mechanisms are never as good. So we wanted to know, what's happening in the brain, and of course what we really were hoping for is normalization. So the good news, I'm hoping you can predict the good news, is that we do get normalization, and I'm going to share that with you. So, but first let's look at children who have been identified as dyslexic and children who are just functioning normally. And you're looking right now at the brains of children who I think were in about 3rd grade when these images were taken. And I could show you thousands of brain scans where you would see virtually the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. So what we see in normal readers is that, I'm not going to go into a deep level, I'm not going to go through the anatomy of the brain, I'm just going to stick to hemispheres, so don't get worried that I'm going to start talking about, and I'm not going to present this like I would to a medical audience. The left hemisphere in a normally reading brain lights up. This is where the language centers are. The right hemisphere, what you see is you get the visual information coming in, and then the brain transfers it across the corpus callosum and goes right over to the left hemisphere. And what you ultimately have is language processing. So the brain now knows what to do with that visual information, and it lands over it's processed for meaning in much the same way that oral language would be processed. Now, if you look at the child with dyslexia, what you see is you have a little visual context. This child, the brain is actually lighting up less than typical. Usually you have a lot more right hemisphere activation, but virtually no left hemisphere activation. And that's what we see over and over again, is that the brain is not knowing what to do with this information. It's bringing it in, but it doesn't know. This brain knows there's something that's supposed to be language related, but it doesn't know how to process it. We see these images again and again and again, which suggests that there really is something real called dyslexia. So when people want to say it's a made-up thing, look at the brains. They're not the same. All right, so we also then had a question, well, can we see differences when children are very young, or do these differences show up after instruction? And so in one of our studies, and this again was done back in about 2001 or 2, we were looking at children. What we did is we went in when they were 5, in the second semester of kindergarten. So by this time they've had some phonemic awareness, they've had letter knowledge. We know they've had some instruction, so it's not a complete clean slate, but they haven't had truly formal reading instruction. Some of them may be starting to read, but for the most part, 5-year-olds at the second semester of kindergarten are not real readers. And so what we see here is the normal child, who is on the right-hand side of your screen, has the typical, you've got a little right hemisphere activation, just like you expect, and you have a very dense activation in the left hemisphere, just like you expect. That is what a normal brain looks like at all ages. And it turns out it happens before they even start to really read. Now, interestingly enough, at 5, before instruction has really occurred, in terms of true reading, you see lots of activation, just like we see in so many dyslexics. We see the visual cortex, the areas of the brain that process. This is what you would see in a brain if you just showed, if I show you a picture of a triangle that has no language attached to it, your brain will light up more like this. So the brain is saying, this is information that's visual. You can see there's some lighting up on the left-hand side, but it's not like it's supposed to be. So the brain's not quite sure what to do with this information. The particular task that the child was being asked to do in this case was to identify a letter name. And so so that does have some language attached to it, but it's still more visual, not like they're having to read whole words at this point. I think that's pretty interesting, because it looks to me like there are clear differences for those that want to naysay and say it doesn't exist. But then, you know, you could get into this idea that, oh, well, their brains are different. It's a done deal. And you do see that belief in the schools that they're dyslexic, and we start using dyslexia as an excuse for why these kids aren't learning. But actually, what it really is a call to action, because we know when we intervene with these kids, and this is the punchline. If we can, so you see a brain, you see the same child's brain in this particular set of images. We see the child before intervention, and you see the typical activation on the right side, but little activation on the left side. But what we see after intervention is now the child's left hemisphere is activating in a normal fashion. That's a call to action, because it means if we can start intervention early with these kids and get their brains normalized, what we find is that they will start reading and they don't have the problems that they might have if we don't start early. These particular set of brains were, well, it's the same child. The picture of this brain were with children that were young. We also had continued intervention. This was taken at a midpoint. We continued intervention, and the activation even got stronger. So this is very important information, because we're changing the way the brain is functioning in a normal way. Now, what I've shared with you so far is young children. What happens with older children? Because is it too late? That's a question we're constantly getting. We often don't even find these children, or they don't come to us for services until they're older. Well, there's some good news and actually a little bit bad news about the older kids. But the good news is their brains also normalize. So you're seeing, this is activation pictures from work being done more recently out of a group out of Harvard and Tufts. What you see again, looking at the normal, and this is work that's been done in the last few years, and so you can see that that the brains of the normal children look exactly like you expect, where the left hemisphere, to different technologies, so the pictures look a little different, but you're seeing that the left hemisphere's got nice activation from the normal kids, and you're seeing the back view, a left view, and the right view. If you then look at the child with dyslexia, and what you're seeing in those last two columns is the same child pre-intervention and post-intervention. And so pre-intervention, you can see that, again, this is a dyslexic looking child. Very little activation. There wasn't, the orange is really what you're looking for. And before intervention, this child had virtually no left hemisphere activation. And again, perhaps overactivation in the right hemisphere, which suggests that you've got a child whose brain knows they're supposed to do something with this information, but doesn't know how to process it. But look what happened after intervention. Now, these are older kids. I think the children in this particular study were more like 5th graders. We see that, again, that after the child is taught how to process the English language at the word level, shown how the syllable types work, shown how the funky vowels all work, you know, we teach them all of that, and then how to do what we call flexing, which is when the sounding out of that word doesn't make an exactly right word. If we teach them all of those things, you get a child whose brain is functioning normally. They can now process words, and that becomes access to language, because now they can make that process, that connection. I think that's very exciting. It means that what we do in schools is so important, because you're changing the nature of the way the children that you're sitting in front of every day, the way their brains are processing this information and normalizing them. And that should make all of us feel very good about the work we do. Okay, so when I talk about intervention, that is the key factor. These children have proven that it's not enough just to read to them and have their parents read with them, and we want that to occur. I'm not saying that these things shouldn't occur. It is not enough, however, to be in a language-rich environment. Those things need to occur. It needs to occur for all children, but it is not adequate. It's not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. We have to intervene with these kids in a much more systematic, explicit, and intense way. And I'll talk a little bit more about exactly what that looks like in just a little bit. I do want to point out one thing that we have learned more recently. And so as we look at the brain location of activation, we see that the brain's completely normalized with children with dyslexia. The one area that may continue to be a challenge, and this is important for when we look at our interventions, is we have what's called ongoing latency, which really is processing speed. So many of these children with dyslexia will continue, the processing of the information goes through the correct routes and locations in the brains, but their brains may do it a little more slowly. And this will show up later in the grades as kids who are a little disfluent or have ongoing fluency issues with processing text. What we also now understand is that if we start focusing on that fluency component early, as in the minute you teach them a sound, a letter sound, you make them do it faster. They don't, they get less and less think time. You've got to push those brains to do it a little faster. That will teach those children's brains to process faster. And that is probably a new piece of information that many interventions have not considered. And so when you're looking at the interventions you're working with, that may be a piece or a layer that you want to add on top. Often we give kids an inordinate amount of time to figure stuff out. And actually, it turns out that if they're having some latency issues, we've got to push them a little bit at a time. In much the same way we teach a track runner to run a little faster or a swimmer to swim a little faster. We're trying to focus not just on how to process the information, but to process it a little faster. Now, in terms of curing dyslexia, it does turn out that age matters a lot. And so where I've shown you that we can normalize the way the brain is processing information, that piece of it doesn't matter so much for age. You can have an adult, dyslexic adult, whose brain will normalize once they're finally taught the information in a consistent, intense, daily way, and their brains will learn to process that information. The problem with that when we get older kids is that they're behind. They're behind across the board. Their vocabulary knowledge will be lower, their background knowledge will be lower, they will have had a whole set of failure experiences by that point. And so it's not that older kids don't respond to intervention, and older kids respond in a lovely way to intervention. The problem is closing the gap, because they're normally achieving peers are clicking along, making steep growth. And if the child is now entering the fray of being able to read words, there's this massive gap in terms of that content. So if we're going to truly cure dyslexia, and when I say cure, I mean that they're functioning like everybody else and they're keeping pace with everybody else, even though clearly they have this genetic issues and they may still have some spelling problems and things. They look normal. There are second graders that are performing like second graders and third graders that are performing like third graders, even if they need some more supports. If that's to happen, we have to get these kids when they're in pre-K, K, and first grade. That's where the action really is, to prevent the issues associated with dyslexia. Once they hit second, third, fourth grade, you also get this cascade of other issues that start to happen. And I know we all understand these issues. One of the biggest issues for these kids is the social emotional trauma that failure experiences brings with it. And it's not just the failure of not learning how to read, it's that the peers in their classes notice that they're quote unquote the dumb ones. If you're in the low reading group or you're not reading at all the other children in your classroom are going to assume you're stupid. And as we all know, kids are pretty cruel. And so, you know, for some of these kids, going to school every day becomes torture because they can become the kids that are targets. That happened to me, actually. I was, by fifth grade, a dropout for all intents and purposes. Now, I went to school a long time ago when they weren't so good about checking attendance and things. I actually used to go hide under my bed. Well, my mother worked, so I was supposed to ride off. She would check, I'd get on my little bicycle and ride my bicycle off to school, supposedly. When I actually was doing on many days was riding it around to the back of the alley, hiding my bicycle, climbing back into my bedroom window, hiding under my bed until my mother left for work, and I'd stay home because it was too hard to go to school. Not that I dislike school per se, but the mental torture of having these kids tease me all the time was quite awful. And so I just share my story because my story is so similar to so many of these other kids. If I had been a smart kid, I don't think I would have been teased like I was. It's also just the missed learning opportunities. The child themselves lowers their expectations. I assure you, I never thought I was smart. Well, I finally figured it out, but it took me a long time to realize that I actually am smart. And it wasn't until as I went up the grades and I was reading and I started doing better because my mental capabilities started taking play. You know, I wasn't on memorization and stuff, that I started realizing, well, I'm not really as stupid as some people think I am. But once you're behind, it's extremely difficult to catch up with peers, and that's the bottom line. So that's why age matters. It's not that it's a done deal for the older kids, and clearly there are plenty of examples of older individuals who have caught up. Clearly I caught up. Others have caught up. It's just so much more difficult for the older child to catch up to their peers or surpass their peers. So again, early intervention is the key. Now, just because I'm saying that we can essentially cure, in other words, reduce the, to where these children look normal compared to their peers at the end of first grade, maybe second grade, we also know that they still will need careful monitoring. So once a dyslexic, always a dyslexic, in terms of the need to have someone monitoring use. We need to have good measurement systems in schools, but really we need to be monitoring all of our kids to make sure nobody's falling out. So measures like DIBELS and other continuous progress monitoring tools, ISIP, or there's different tools out there, but we need to be measuring to make sure no child's falling out. And the kid that was at one point dyslexic or receiving those services will need to be monitored more carefully to make sure that they're not falling behind and that we're propping them up as necessary. We will find that these children tend to have ongoing spelling issues because spelling is a little trickier than reading. However, if we've really taught them how the structure of the English language works, they often spell perhaps even better than their peers who weren't given that information. Because let's face it, many of our kids have terrible spelling because we're not typically in our general education programs teaching how the structure of the English language works very well, at least at that word level. Some of these kids may have disorganization, organizational issues, executive functioning. Some of these kids may have comorbidity with ADHD or ADD, which is not dyslexia, but about 25% of kids with dyslexia will have that comorbidity. And so we have to, we have to find out which each individual child needs. And if they have those other issues, we've got to address those other issues as well. But we do know that children who get up to normal performance levels, which we're talking like standard scores of 100 or above on a Woodcock-Johnson or some other measures, they tend to perform normally from then on out. That the problems with reading are not the stressors they have. They may have other issues that show up. And this has now been replicated multiple times. And so that's important, that it's not just like we found it in one study. It's been over time that these kids tend to be fine if we can get them where they need to be. At the end of first grade is really what we're talking about. So what does a highly effective intervention look like? And we know a lot about that now. And so you're going to want to go in and some of the earlier interventions have pieces of this, but you may find that you want to overlay some new content onto existing interventions. It's primarily around the fluency work that we're now understanding is more important. As I share this with you today, I'm not going to name specific interventions because I'm not here to sell anything. Of course, I like the ones that I've written myself the best, but you can look those up yourself. But there are many good interventions, and those that fall into that category of structured English, language instruction, typically have most or all of these components. So we want interventions that teach children how to become sensitive to the sounds that they hear in words. We talk about that as phonemic awareness, but that term really means sensitive to the sounds that they're hearing, and that we then use that information for both sounding out or decoding words and encoding words, which is spelling them, using those two as a loop. We want the programs then clearly teach those children how the sounds that they're hearing in words when they're said orally are mapping onto printed words, which we talk about as teaching phonics. But we're not teaching memorization per se of rules. We're teaching them how these sounds are mapping onto printed words. And so if you've got a very rule-bound program that's not, sometimes kids, the rules are good to teach. It's that sometimes kids aren't making the connection between the rule and what's actually happening with the words. So we've got to make sure that connection is happening for kids. We then want to make sure that we're working with a program that goes beyond the single syllable. And there's a lot, it seems like we do a lot with kids in the very beginning, really around in English, the CVC syllable type. And we should spend all this time working on short vowels, and maybe we get to, how the long vowels work. But we've got to make sure that we clearly teach kids to recognize words at the syllable level. And in English, there's really 6 syllable types, 7 if you consider irregular schwa a syllable type. And programs that have speeded syllable work appear to be very effective. So that's something you want to look at, because those kids, and they don't have to know, it's called an open and a closed. We don't care if they know the names of the syllables. What we care about is that they're reading words and they're being taught how these their brains are processing the various syllable types of English quickly so that they can process multisyllabic words quickly. And dyslexic kids do find reading multisyllabic words, big words, they sort of freak out. And lots of kids do. Kids that are not dyslexic also freak out at quote unquote the big words because they're not being taught how to parse those words into the sections and to recognize the units, what we call unitizing sections or chunks of words. We also want to make sure that the programs or the interventions that we're working with kids move the children into word building very quickly. So once they've got the sounds and they've got a few letters, they're recognizing that, the letter M or the letter M makes an M sound. And let's say they've got the A and they understand it makes the A sound and the T makes the T sound. Those are my 3 favorite letters to teach first, that we immediately start going into at and mat. And tam, I guess that's a word, although I wouldn't teach tam first. That even though they may not know all the letters yet, the sounds that represent all the letters, they can start building words, and that those 2 tracks of information, learning the names and sounds, the names and how the sounds of the letters map and how the map those onto words, that those 2 strands of information are accompanying each other, that are happening in concert with each other, versus some programs that I've seen where the kids have to learn all the sounds of all the letters in terms of the letter sound recognition before they get into word building. And those tend to be less, well, kids with dyslexia often have memory issues. And so now we're really putting a big burden on them to memorize information that is not connected to meaning. And so when we connect it to words, then they start understanding the meaning. And so that's something to look at the interventions that you're using. We also know that just because a child is dyslexic does not mean that their vocabulary and comprehension is where it needs to be. Although dyslexia is really a word recognition issue separate from vocabulary and comprehension, it's not you can have a child who's dyslexic and who has a broader language problem, but the dyslexia piece of it is not necessarily the same as the language. However, we do want to make sure that we're developing the vocabulary and the comprehension so they're keeping track with their peers from the very beginning. So it is important that we're not focused solely on word work, that we're bringing in the vocabulary and the comprehension as well from the beginning. Even though children are purely dyslexic won't demonstrate the serious vocabulary and comprehension deficits, it doesn't mean that they will develop deficits if we don't teach them enough vocabulary and comprehension from the beginning. And then the other piece of it that we now understand is so critical for so many of these children is this work on fluency from the beginning. And when I say fluency from the beginning, I'm talking about things such as when we teach the letter sounds. Let's say, go back to that and t, that we're not just saying, okay, holding up a card and saying, what's the sound for this letter? And letting them think. We're saying, what's the sound? And making them do it really fast and making them do it a little faster. And not shortening up that think time so their brains are having to process. And then when they're sounding out words, at first you can be a little slow, but then we got to let's do it faster. Let's do it faster. Read that word fast. And then finally read the word fast the first time. That's how I explain it to kids. Let's go think it in your head, do it fast. So their brains are learning that it's not enough just to work through this information, it's got to process the information fast. And that's the only way we know to overcome those children who they'll show up in the young grades as having low RAN, and we'll talk about the measures in just a little bit. And RAN is a very good predictor of a child who's going to have a low RAN score, or a poor RAN score is a good predictor of a child who's not processing information in the brain fast, and who will show up when they get into connected text reading as a disfluent reader. We also know that programs that have children spell words and listen, spell it the way you hear it, and then attach the correct spelling of the way the sound was heard in that word, if it has multiple spellings for a particular sound, that programs that have encoding in service to word recognition are stronger than programs that focus solely on always reading the words. So taking it to that notch where spelling is incorporated into activities, as well as reading words. They're happening in unison. We end up with kids who are processing that information even better. And in programs that are having children not only spell individual words, but spell connected or write connected text with correct spelling, that improves their comprehension. So that's a lot for a program to incorporate. So what I say to you is look at the programs that you have adopted in your districts, and the chances are that they do many of these things, but there may be some things that you need to insert or bolster. And if it's one of the older programs, it's usually the fluency component that I'm seeing that wasn't espoused clearly from the beginning. Also, that these programs have lots and lots of cumulative practice, that you don't just teach a skill and it goes away. If the program that you're working with teaches a skill and then it teaches another skill but doesn't review all the previously taught skills in a very systematic way, you'll have kids that probably don't respond as well, because our children, the ones with dyslexia, tend to have some underlying memory issues too, because their brains don't process this information as easily, so they're losing it more quickly. So that cumulative practice and speeded practice is an important component of a highly effective intervention.
Dr. Mathis, we have a question.
Okay.
Are there any programs for increasing processing speed in 20-something adults with severe dyslexia and processing speed issues, or is it too late to make a difference?
Well, first off, it's never too late to intervene. So that should be one of the big takeaway messages from this talk. So the big takeaway is early is best, but it's never too late. So if you end up working with, if you go down to the prison systems, which I have done a little bit, you're going to find a lot of people that have never learned to read well. And many of them have true dyslexia. Some of them are dyslexia, and there's a lot of combination therein. Those individuals can learn to read, and the processing speed can happen. It's again processing faster and faster. Some of the work by I'm going to have to draw a blank here. Marianne, oh gosh, what's Marianne's last name? Out of tough, so I'm going to come back to that. But there are some programs that have specific fluency work built into them. I wasn't wanting to talk specific names because I'm not here to pitch any particular programs, but there are interventions, and it's not so much the grade level that the intervention was designed for. It's more about how mature the materials look for the older student. So if you've got an older student, you don't want to pull out materials with cute little pictures of animals and bunnies and such, but the actual skills that the children or the adult or the young adult would be working on might not look so different. They just need to look more mature. The older adult typically has more skills. So the young adult or the older student typically has more what I call Swiss cheese skills. So they have a skill here and a little hole and a skill, and so often it's a little easier or faster to move them through and catch them up in terms of this learning how to process this information, because it's not like they're a clean slate. With the younger children who are completely clean slates, it can be more intense. But with the older student, the issue is not that they can't learn these skills, it's that they have so much content knowledge in terms of vocabulary and comprehension, and then their fluency, and that's a skill that you practice. And if they're very disfluent, they're going to be making progress, but they're still going to be significantly behind their peers. So it's really, it's just going to take, eventually everybody graduates from high school, and I guess they can catch up at that point. So it gets a little more difficult the older they get. So in terms of adopting interventions in your schools, there are a number that have been proven to be effective, and so it bequeaths it. What we need to make sure we're doing is checking that the interventions that we're providing and using with our kids who are dyslexic have been proven to be effective for kids who struggle. Now, often these studies have not been done specifically with kids that are quote unquote labeled dyslexic. So I'm not saying that the program that you are adopting has to have proven effectiveness with that title. Often these studies have been done with kids in special education who have the title learning disability. Well, one of the three main learning disabilities is dyslexia. So kids who have that title of LD, who are receiving, you know, resource room instruction or what have you, are most likely truly dyslexic because if they're receiving reading services for LD, because that's really what that's supposed to be. It may be done with kids who are showing at risk. So like much of the work I've done in the programs we've developed with my research were done with children before they were identified as dyslexic. Our goal was to prevent the need to ever apply that label. So in our work, we would have just said these kids were at risk for serious reading disabilities or reading problems. So that's a caveat. You want to make sure that your curriculum has a randomized controlled trial if possible, and it's not just people saying, oh, this was great, I loved it, my kids love it. That there's real evidence, because these kids don't respond to lots of things that, you know, are popular. Just because it's popular doesn't mean it's right for our kids. That you really want to look at that list of elements and then see if this particular curriculum has ever been incorporated into a real scientific trial with kids who are true strugglers, even if the title wasn't dyslexic. Was there another? I see that I've got some more questions. There was a hand wave. Somebody raised their hand.
Yeah, yes, thank you. Can you elaborate on the type of certifications or qualifications that you would like to see in the dyslexic intervention specialist?
So that's a very good question on what qualifications. So I think that the IDA and the certification that they're doing with their the reading center, the national. I'm just blanking on terms today. I guess my dyslexia is showing. The IDA has a very nice list of requirements of what a teacher who's working directly with children with dyslexia should know. And it's a deep knowledge. First thing that a teacher of dyslexic children should have is a very deep knowledge of the structure of the English language. And we can test that. And what we know is when we do test teachers in general education, I'm just sharing this, and I've done some of this work myself. Louisa Moats has done quite a bit of it. Some people out of Texas A&M, other groups. We find that the typical teacher coming out of general ed, and I'm not expecting that these teachers have deep knowledge of dyslexia because they've never had the training, so I'm not trying to beat up on them, but we need to understand that the typical teacher teaching reading to all kids has perhaps 50% or less of the knowledge base that is required. We also tested reading coaches that were working with general ed teachers and found that they actually only possess about the same amount of knowledge, which was distressing. That was coaches being hired in the typical classroom. Another question?
Yes. Christine asks, earlier on you talked about beginning intervention as early as pre-K and K in first grade. The range of typical development in students aged 3+ to 7 is so wide. How then do you determine who is really dyslexic and who is at the lower end of the normal range?
So what I would say is in pre-K, I'm not going to get so tied up with identifying which kids are dyslexic. But what I am going to do at that grade level is make sure that I'm really teaching that sound sensitivity and that we're starting to recognize letters. And so at the pre-K level, it's more about intervening with everybody because all the children need this information, and we need to do it in a very systematic way and fun way. It can be very fun at that age level. These kids at 4, at pre-K, you know, it's really about making sure they have that language knowledge and that they're hearing the sounds within words. And that what you start to notice very quickly is which kids aren't getting it. And so the children, that once we start providing this information in a more systematic way, who are struggling to learn it, that's the red flag at pre-K. As they enter kindergarten, what you'll see is that most kindergarten children, as they enter kindergarten, actually know the names of most of the letters. They actually have started to connect the sounds. After if they've gone to pre-K in particular, they have some level of phonemic awareness. They can typically isolate the initial sound from the onset. You know, they can do an onset rhyme split. The children who are at risk for dyslexia are not doing those things very well. And so as you're going through kindergarten, if you notice that you have a child in kindergarten who is not learning the names of the letters easily, they're still stuck. They only know some of them, and it's not easy. And they're certainly not, and if they're not making the connection to the sounds of those letters, which are being taught. This is content now that is being taught in every kindergarten across the world, well, at least in the USA. They have their letter of the week. What you'll often see is these kids can do the letter of the week during the letter of the week, and then a few weeks later they don't remember the letter of the week, which is a good indicator that they've got some memory issues going on. And they may memorize the sound of a letter, but they don't start connecting that it's used in words. That to them, the "a" and the "a", those are just two things you say about this shape, but they're not connecting it to meaning in terms of words. And so those are some of the indicators. And they're having trouble hearing the sounds. That's not becoming apparent to them. So those are the good indicators. By the second semester of kindergarten, if you've worked with these kids, you don't even have to do all of these formal assessments. You should have a pretty good idea which kids are in trouble and which kids need to be put into some more intensive intervention pretty quickly. As they enter first grade, it's very easy to determine who these kids are. They don't know all their letter names. They don't know all their letter sounds. They're not connecting sounds to words. They still are having phonemic awareness issues. You know, the kids, when you say, tell me the sounds you hear in the word cat, will meow back at you, not understanding that you're asking them to parse that into k, an a, and a t sound. And so when they don't do those things, and they've had some instruction by this, regardless of their home environments, if they've been in kindergarten, you know they've had some instruction and they're not getting it. Their brains aren't processing it easily. So those kids, I say, let's put them right into some intensive intervention. And maybe at his home environment, it won't hurt those kids to get intervention. So I get less worried about determining exactly which kid is dyslexic and which kid might be having a serious reading problem for another reason. I'm more concerned about, let's get these kids into intervention. What you'll see with the dyslexic kids, the children that are truly have brain issues, genetically, neurologically based issues, is that when they get into these small group intensive interventions, it's still harder to move them along. They take more work. They're the ones that require teachers with much higher knowledges and expertise, and teachers who are able to take this basic curriculum that we've adopted and can tweak it based on the needs of the child. And the children who maybe just had linguistic or familial issues but not genetic issues, what you see with them is they zoom fast, and you'll often find yourself needing to regroup these kids because some are taking off and moving faster and some are moving a little slower. It's the ones that are probably moving slower that we can then finally say, you know what, these kids are dyslexic, and we're going to keep working with them. We're not letting them go because we can get them to where they need to be if we keep working with them on a daily basis in an intensive way. It may be reteaching and going back and redoing things and moving along we're moving them as quickly through the pacing of the curriculum as we can, but it also means constantly reteaching so that they can master whatever content it is. So those kids are just harder to work with, and they take more expertise and teachers who are more loving and forgiving and patient, and yet still hold those expectations high. It's a hard job to do it. So in terms of so the first step is to adopt an intervention that has proven effectiveness, and then you need the expert teacher layered on top of that who can take this curriculum that's been laid out with a good scope and sequence and things and and provides sort of a template from which to start the instruction. But the teacher then, working with these kids that are in front of her or him at that moment, is then having to do what I call tweaking it based on the needs of the kids in front of them. And that may be me inserting little mini lessons into the curriculum, or redoing pieces that you thought, you don't just go blowing through the curriculum if the kids aren't mastering it. We also know that this instruction must be delivered in small groups. And by small groups, we're really looking at about a group size of about 3. And grouping sizes have actually been researched. Sharon Vaughn and some others have done some real concerted work at what is the ideal group size. And one of the things that actually was a surprise to me was to find out that one-on-one instruction may not be as effective as a very small group. And so it looks to be about a group size of about 3 seems to be about ideal for these children. You may think, what? One-on-one's not as effective? Well, I guess the jury's a little out on that, but it does appear that maybe when you have a group, it takes some of the heat off of you. Maybe you hear another answer from another student some of the time, and maybe it creates more opportunities to rehearse or repeat content where you may not get that in a one-on-one. Once you get beyond group sizes of well, certainly group size is bigger than, say, 5. So you're getting to groups of, say, 5, 6, 7, 8 kids. That is no longer a small group. And children with dyslexia are not going to benefit from group sizes that are that big. So when we talk about these kids with dyslexia, and if we're doing like a tiered model and a multi-tiered system, we're really talking about moving directly to tier 3 with small groups and sort of forgoing tier 2 until they get up and going, and then we can go back to supporting them with the tier 2. Identification early, obviously I've said this again and again, we want to do it early. The good news is you don't have to do brain scans. Woohoo! We don't have to do the brain scans, just confirm what our assessment tools tell us. The assessment tools that we use in our schools are actually very good. Tools like the PALS, the TPRI, DIBBLS, ISIP, iReady, these various tools that are out there actually have very good measures. In kindergarten and pre-K, what we're looking at is phonological awareness. I say phonological versus phonemic awareness because we really want to see if they're starting to alliterate and rhyme. We should start getting into first sound and the ability to blend by middle first kindergarten. They should start learning their letter names in pre-K and kindergarten, so if they're not doing that, we know that's a marker. They should be able to do rapid naming of objects and colors, not names of letters per se, but objects and colors. And if they're random, the ability to name things that they know is slow, that's an indicator of risk. By first grade, then we should be seeing true phonemic awareness. So entering first grade students should be able to isolate out first sounds. They should be able to blend. By middle first grade, we want to see that they're doing phoneme segmentation pretty well. Elision is a task that may or may not ever be mastered by these kids. Phoneme segmentation that we definitely want to see happening. And if they're not doing it by mid-first grade, that's a real problem. They should know the names and sounds of most letters entering first grade, and of course rapid naming. Also in first grade, as they enter, they should be reading. Most first graders can read 5 to 8 words, and so if they're not reading any words yet, that's a pretty good indicator. So getting back to the idea that the teachers in our schools often, the dyslexia specialist is often the bearer of all the knowledge, has the deeper knowledge, and your special ed teachers may or may not have that knowledge, because many special ed programs really don't teach reading, or they send the reading teacher. The reading courses are taught by the general ed faculty, and so don't assume that your special ed teachers have that deep knowledge. Your general education teachers typically do not have that deep knowledge, and most kids will learn to read without a teacher who has that deep knowledge, but these kids need deep knowledge. And so we do find that we need, and even the dyslexia specialists, they'll have the deep knowledge, but they have children that still provide challenges that they need some assistance with. So we do see that teachers and administrators need support with working with these kids. So it is important that we figure out how to so within a building, you really need a concerted effort. It's not enough to have a general ed program that's teaching reading in one way and a dyslexia program. If they're not consistent and working in a unit in a way that, you know, they don't have to teach exactly the same stuff, but they need to at least be consistent with the methods and the way that it's being taught, or you'll confuse kids. And so we want to make sure we need to provide some coaching and support for these teachers. Now, the Hoop platform, which was developed specifically out of this need to support teachers of reading, is one mechanism that we can be using using technology, where coaches and teachers in general ed, in dyslexia, in special ed can be put into teams to support one another as we work with these kids. So putting in a little pitch for my own software there. But we know that we need to support. It's not just enough to say we're going to send these kids to dyslexia. They have to be part of a bigger system. So we've got to figure that piece out. The last thing I want to share with you is some of the resources. And you'll notice here the last bullet has the knowledge and practice standards for teachers of reading. Those standards are really what we know that teachers of reading, and in particular teachers of reading of kids with dyslexia, but really all teachers, it's very clearly delineated. You can also look for teacher preparation programs that have been approved, and there's actually only a very few of those. So these are resources that are available on the IDA website. Of course, I want you to all read Annals of Dyslexia, because I am the editor of that particular journal. That is where we're getting the newest research. That's really more of an academic journal on the latest information. The Examiner then takes that information and makes it more teacher-friendly, more in perspectives. So those two are very highly recommended for parents and for teachers in general. So these are very good resources that are available to all of us. And that really concludes our session today. So I'm giving you the information of the websites, the Dyslexia Association and our Hood Education website, if you want any more information about that. Guy, you want to take us?
Yes, we'd like to thank everyone for participating in the International Dyslexia Association webinar session with Dr. Patricia Mathis. Today's presentation will be available online at both websites that are located on that screen that you're seeing there. We'll send out an additional email follow-up so that you can see that information and have access to it, and be able to see the recorded presentation as well as the slide presentation. And any questions that you posed during the presentation that we were not able to answer due to lack of time, Dr. Mathis will answer those questions, and we will post a link as well with the transcript for those answers and responses. Once again, we'd like to thank the IDA for hosting this webinar and Hood Education for providing the technology to allow us to participate. Have a great afternoon.